Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics. In this video, well, let's bring Dominic Cummings back into our mind's eye. I'd like to discuss the extent to which Cummings may have seen his influence wane. There was certainly some evidence of that. Did the reshuffle give an indication that he's still on top, despite possibly declining power? But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, Dominic Cummings, in case you don't know, been living under a rock or something, he's the guy behind the Vote Leave campaign and more recently Boris Johnson's chief political strategist, and the man who has apparently been given the power to completely tear down the civil service in the wake of the general election result. And he might be looking a little bit more vulnerable. So just a month ago, people were saying that Boris Johnson essentially was only listening to two people. He was ignoring everyone else's advice. He was listening only to Dominic Cummings and his mistress, Carrie Symonds. And it was only Johnson's patronage that has given Dominic Cummings the powers he has. Nobody else really likes him. There's a few people who sort of support some of the things he wants to do, but no one really likes him. Not ministers, not very many civil servants. Most of the civil service are against him because, of course, he intends to completely change their system. And the unique way in which Dominic Cummings does that is he says, this is what we're going to do and we're going to do it in this way. He doesn't really brook, much like Boris Johnson, I suppose, anyone going, yeah, but had you thought about this consequence? He doesn't do that. The problem with that sort of mind is even if you're quite a brilliant mind, and maybe he is, maybe he isn't, but he's certainly considered an original thinker, fair enough. But you go ahead with things. And the problem with original thoughts is that, generally speaking, not a lot of people have done them. So there's not a lot of a track record there. So you have to be particularly careful to try and think of adverse consequences. He's not doing that. So this is why there's a certain... Although there are those in the civil service who are reformers and are fully on board with the idea of reforming the civil service, and I'd sort of be on board with that, I think quite a lot are not really convinced that Dominic Cummings is the right man to mastermind it, given the fact he doesn't really consider things. And as for other ministers, well, he's personally insulted almost all of them in his time. He frequently insults the Conservatives and the Conservative government. One particularly famous example being given a public speech, which you can easily see if you look online, telling the audience that, of course, the Conservatives don't care about the NHS and they don't care about ordinary people. Cummings is an extremely confrontational entity. He's making enemies left, right and centre. It's this feature which, above all others, exposes for me his political naivety. In politics, you need allies. Yes, you are going to make enemies. If you wish to make your mark at all in this world, you will make enemies, particularly in politics. But you need allies. And Cummings essentially has one ally, Boris Johnson. It's enough for now because Boris Johnson is the law in the land. But the whispers in Boris Johnson's ears from, his other supporters will be to ditch Cummings. They'll link every failure to Cummings' advice, and there will be failures for all the power Johnson now holds. He doesn't have a lot of competence around him. He hasn't abolished the independent judiciary or democratic accountability just yet, though he is working on it. Now, the battle to really watch, I would have said a few days ago, the battle to really watch would be between Dominic Cummings and Sajid Javid. So Javid, of course, was Chancellor, and he held the most senior position in the cabinet, aside from Prime Minister, until this week. And against the wishes of Dominic Cummings. Dominic Cummings wanted him gone a long time ago. He didn't want him anywhere near cabinet. Cummings flexed his muscles a couple of times last year by sacking two of Sajid Javid's senior aides, much to his disgust. And, it's something that Cummings had no authority to do either, but the Prime Minister backed him at the time. Sajid Javid was not a happy bunny. Cummings wanted him out of the job. He sort of got his way. Johnson said to Javid that you could keep your job, but you've got to sack all your advisors and just use my advisors. The Chancellor at the time, Sajid Javid, refused and so resigned, buggered off. So a partial victory for Cummings. But let's see what damage Javid can do from the backbenchers. Because the thing is that Boris Johnson seems to be genuinely disturbed that Javid is no longer in his cabinet. I don't think he intended him to resign. It's not easy to tell because obviously I am very far removed from the Westminster and the Downing Street bubbles. by a couple 100 miles at least. But Johnson seemed to be making a lot of noise about, oh, there's ways back into cabinet for Sajid Javid. There's ways back in, as if he didn't really want him to leave. I mean, this is a man who made him Chancellor, for goodness sake. He wanted him in his cabinet. And when Boris Johnson gave that ultimatum to his former Chancellor, it doesn't seem to have been with the intention of actually having him walk out. It is possible that that was Cummings' plan. Maybe Cummings said to Boris Johnson, look, he shouldn't have his own advisers. He may have given him history lessons from the past of where chancellors have been at odds with the Prime Minister. The Chancellor is a very, very senior position and can sometimes frustrate the Prime Minister at times. And he's saying, look, you don't want this, do you? Use the same advisor so there's none of this them and us between number 10 and number 11, which is number 11 Downing Street, by the way, where the Chancellor lives. And it may be that, that was the whispers in Johnson's ear to get him to do it. Cummings knowing full well that Javid would leave, and so maybe he sort of got his way, but with Boris Johnson doing it inadvertently. Either way, it does seem that Johnson doesn't want Javid away from the heart of government for long, something that Cummings does want. So there's a little bit of a disagreement there. Cummings is also opposed to the influence of Carrie Symonds, Boris Johnson's girlfriend, mistress, whatever you want to call her. In choosing to have taken on both Javid and Symonds at the same time, he was basically taking on the Prime Minister's girlfriend and most senior cabinet colleague at once. And, he may well feel that he's won round one with the resignation of Javid, but I don't think he'll dislodge Symonds so easily. And perhaps not Javid so permanently. And Cummings faced another defeat earlier in the week as well in terms of his influence. So he is resolutely against HS2, the continuation of HS2, the funding for it. He wanted the project abandoned. He was quite clear about that. And it wasn't a whim of his. He was dead against it, and he urged the Prime Minister very strongly to oppose it. Boris Johnson has backed it, thus indicating that Cummings' influence has waned somewhat. And I was actually wondering to myself, what did persuade Boris Johnson to back it? It wasn't Dominic Cummings. He's been publicly against it. I don't think it would have been Carrie Symonds either. I don't know that she's said anything publicly, or I've not seen her say anything publicly. But she is a very committed environmentalist. Surely should have opposed it on those grounds. I mean, there is a lot of opposition to HS2 on environmental grounds. Sajid Javid was known to be very much in favour of the project. So again, when Boris Johnson made the announcement, I was thinking to myself, is Sajid Javid getting a bit more influence in, separating Boris Johnson a little bit from Dominic Cummings and Carrie Symonds? But given that Johnson has allowed him to resign, I'm not so sure. Interesting though. Of course, without really knowing the reasons why Boris Johnson backed the project, it's difficult to say whether or not it's because others are having more influence than Cummings, or if it's something else. And if Cummings ever does piss off Johnson, there won't be any allies urging the Prime Minister to stick with him because of what he can bring. Because as politically naive as Cummings is, he is, like I said, considered an original thinker who could, in theory, be put to some good use. He's got a good enough brain to be put to some good use. Unfortunately, he tends to put it to evil. But he spent so much time making enemies of everyone who can't do anything for him, including former employers like Michael Gove, that you would think his position is quite tenuous. The minute, Boris Johnson isn't fully seized of him. And as I say, he's not going along with everything that Dominic Cummings is saying at the moment. A wiser man would realise that he's been given carte blanche to reform the civil service and that he could just get on with that, with Johnson's backing, and ignore everything else. But because he doesn't let things go, because he has such disdain for people who he thinks is an idiot, and he thinks everyone that's not him is an idiot, then, he's picking fights with everyone, and there's a good chance, you would think, that he's going to struggle to last the year out. Because with each new enemy he makes, he just isolates him more and more. And of course, Boris Johnson, it's clear now, is listening to other people. And if that continues... But anyway, that's how I read it at the moment. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found the video interesting, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then also please click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.